In the gleaming conference room of Blueprint Dynamics' Chicago headquarters, a seasoned operations architect was about to witness the ultimate corporate betrayal. What started as a routine CEO succession announcement took a shocking turn when they came face to face with 20 years of invisible contributions being erased in real time. Leona Reyes wasn't your typical behind-the-scenes executive. For 2 decades, she had spent her life turning corporate chaos into billion-dollar success, known for her ability to solve impossible problems that others couldn't even diagnose. When she encountered Jonas Coyle presenting her own crisis management framework as his strategic innovation, she had no idea she was walking into the moment that would finally break her professional diplomacy. Leona's quiet resignation that would lead to the systematic dismantling of everything Blueprint thought they owned. What began as corporate indifference would become a masterclass in competence-driven revenge. The Chicago consulting world would never be the same after one woman decided to stop building other people's empires and started signing her own blueprints. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and betrayal, though only one of those scents was intentional. Leona Reyes sat in her usual chair, third from the left, close enough to the presentation screen to catch every detail, far enough from the head of the table to avoid the spotlight she'd never sought. 20 years of board meetings had taught her the geography of power, and she'd learned to navigate it like a cartographer of corporate indifference. The anticipation in the room was thick enough to cut. For months, whispers had circulated about CEO Richard Brennan's retirement plans, and for months, Leona had allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. Not the bright, naive kind, she'd buried that long ago, but the steady, practical hope of someone who'd spent 2 decades fixing what others broke, who'd turned a scrappy 6-person engineering firm into a billion-dollar force through sheer competence and relentless attention to detail. "Before we begin," Brennan said, adjusting his glasses with the theatrical precision of a man who knew he was about to change lives, "I want to thank everyone who made this transition possible. The board and I have spent considerable time evaluating not just our immediate needs, but our long-term vision for Blueprint Dynamics." Leona's hands remained still in her lap, though her pulse quickened. She'd written that transition strategy. Hell, she'd written half the company's strategic playbook, one crisis at a time, one impossible deadline at a time. The sole supplier, meltdown of 2019. The Milan restructuring that everyone said couldn't be done in 6 months. The Athena Aerospace pitch that had just netted them a $950 million contract. Her fingerprints were on every major success story in the company's recent history, even if her name rarely appeared in the press releases. "Innovation requires fresh perspective," Brennan continued, and something cold settled in Leona's chest. Fresh perspective. In corporate speak, that usually meant expensive and external, which is why I'm thrilled to introduce our new CEO, Jonas Coyle. The words hit like a physical blow, but Leona's expression didn't change. She'd perfected the art of corporate composure over the years, the ability to absorb disappointment, without flinching, to smile politely while calculating the exact degree of her own invisibility. Jonas Coyle. She knew the name, of course. Former startup founder, one moderately successful exit, a trail of layoffs disguised as strategic pivots, and the kind of venture capital connections that made board members weak in the knees. Jonas entered the room like he owned it, which Leona supposed he now did. Tall, confident, with the kind of studied casualness that screamed expensive consulting fees. His smile was perfect. Too perfect, like it had been focus grouped and optimized for maximum trust-building impact. "Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for the warm welcome." His voice carried the smooth authority of someone who'd never had to earn respect the hard way. "I'm excited to bring my experience in scaling disruptive technologies to Blueprint's already impressive foundation. The work you've all done, especially the operational excellence that's made our recent wins possible, is exactly what we'll build on as we enter this next phase of growth. Operational excellence. Leona almost laughed at the euphemism. Operational. Excellence was her working 18-hour days to salvage the German expansion when their lead contractor went bankrupt. Operational excellence was her rebuilding their entire supply chain methodology from scratch after the cybersecurity breach that nearly killed 3 major client relationships. But sure, call it operational excellence. Make it sound like something that happened by accident. I've had the pleasure of reviewing our pipeline, Jonas continued, and I'm particularly excited about the strategies that led to our Athena success. The kind of forward-thinking approach that positions Blueprint as not just a service provider, but a true innovation partner. The Athena strategies. Her strategies. Leona had spent 3 months developing that framework, working through contingencies and risk matrices while Jonas was still asking his headhunter how to spell decentralization. She'd walked him through every talking point just 2 weeks ago, watched him scribble down insights that had taken her years to develop. Now they were his vision, his strategic approach, his foundation for the future. The meeting continued with the usual corporate theater, discussions of transition timelines, reporting structures, and cultural integration. Leona participated when required, asked the appropriate questions, nodded at the appropriate moments. Inside, she was performing a different kind of calculation, measuring the exact weight of 20 years of loyalty against the crushing realization that loyalty without leverage was just another word for expendable. "I'd like to close," Jonas said, his gaze settling on Leona with what she was sure he thought was magnanimous recognition, "by acknowledging the incredible foundation that's been built here. The steady leadership, the operational discipline, the kind of behind-the-scenes excellence that makes everything else possible. That's the blueprint, no pun intended, for our continued success." Behind-the-scenes excellence. There it was, wrapped in a compliment that felt like a coffin. She was the behind-the-scenes excellence, the steady leadership that made everything else possible. Essential but invisible, valuable but not promotable, trusted but not elevated. She was the infrastructure that everyone relied on, but no one remembered to credit. The meeting ended with handshakes and congratulations, with promises of exciting changes and continued collaboration. Leona shook Jonas's hand, looked him in the eye, and said all the right things about looking forward to working together. She even managed to inject the appropriate level of enthusiasm into her voice, the kind of team player energy that had served her well for 2 decades. But as she walked back to her office, past the wall of achievement plaques that bore her fingerprints but rarely her name, past the conference rooms where she'd negotiated deals that saved millions, and the quiet corners where she'd mentored the next generation of engineers, Leona felt something shift. Not anger, that was too hot, too immediate. What she felt was colder, more deliberate. The quiet recognition that the game she'd been playing was rigged, and she'd been the only one who didn't know the rules. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a text from Maya Foster, Blueprint's head of human resources. "Hi, Leona. Would love to chat about the transition and your continued role. You're such a valuable part of what makes this place run smoothly. Let's make sure we're positioning you for maximum impact in your current lane. Coffee tomorrow? Maximum impact in your current lane?" Leona stared at the message, reading it twice, then set her phone face down on her desk. Outside her window, Chicago's skyline stretched toward a gray March sky, a forest of steel and glass built by people whose names were carved in stone and cast in bronze. She'd helped build Blueprint's place in that skyline, but her name wasn't going on any plaques. For the first time in 20 years, Leona Reyes began to wonder what would happen if she stopped being indispensable to everyone else and started being essential to herself. The erasure began quietly, the way most professional assassinations do, with meetings she wasn't invited to and decisions made in conference rooms that had suddenly become too small for her presence. Leona first noticed it 3 days after the announcement, when she tried to access the Q2 strategic planning folder and found her permissions had been quietly revoked. A small thing, an administrative oversight surely. But small things had a way of becoming patterns, and patterns had a way of becoming statements. She sat in her office, staring at the error message on her screen, and felt the familiar weight of corporate gaslighting settling around her shoulders like a too-heavy coat. How many times had she seen this happen to others? The slow squeeze, the gradual repositioning, the careful removal of access and authority until the person in question began to question their own value. She'd always told herself it was different for her. She was indispensable after all. Blueprint couldn't function without her institutional knowledge, her crisis management skills, her ability to see 3 moves ahead when everyone else was still figuring out the rules of the game. Apparently, she'd been wrong about that, too. "Leona, got a minute?" Maya Foster appeared in her doorway like a HR-shaped storm cloud, all professional smiles and passive-aggressive concern. "I wanted to follow up on our coffee chat about your role transition." "I don't recall us having that chat," Leona said, not looking up from her computer screen. "Though I did get your text about maximum impact in my current lane." Maya's smile flickered, a brief crack in the corporate facade. "Right, yes. Well, I was hoping we could discuss some exciting opportunities to leverage your operational expertise in support of Jonas's strategic initiatives. There's so much institutional knowledge locked up in your experience. We want to make sure we're utilizing that effectively. Like she was a piece of software that needed better integration, a database that required more efficient queries." Leona finally looked up, studying Maya's carefully composed expression. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Well, Jonas has some ambitious plans for Q3, and frankly, he's going to need someone with your depth of knowledge to help execute them. Think of it as senior advisory. You'd be instrumental in helping him navigate the complexities of our existing client relationships while he focuses on the big-picture vision work." Senior advisory. The kind of role they gave to people right before they suggested early retirement packages. Leona had seen enough corporate restructuring to recognize the script. First, they position you as indispensable support. Then, they gradually transfer your responsibilities to other people. Finally, they thank you for your years of service and suggest it might be time for new challenges. "I see," Leona said. "And who would be handling the day-to-day operational decisions while I'm advising?" "Oh, we're bringing in some additional talent to help with the workload. Fresh perspectives, you know. Jonas is really excited about building a more agile leadership structure." More agile. Because 20 years of keeping the company solvent through 3 recessions, 2 major market shifts, and countless client crises wasn't agile enough. Because the person who'd built their entire operational framework from the ground up somehow lacked the flexibility to adapt to new challenges. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, a masterclass in corporate doublespeak that left Leona feeling like she'd been slowly suffocated by a cloud of buzzwords and false enthusiasm. When Maya finally left, her office felt smaller, somehow, as if the walls had crept inward while she wasn't paying attention. The rest of the week confirmed what she already knew. Her name disappeared from email chains she'd been part of for years. Meetings were scheduled around her availability rather than including her input. The new agile leadership structure, apparently, meant that decisions were made faster by cutting out the people who actually understood the consequences of those decisions. Jonas, meanwhile, was everywhere. The company newsletter featured a lengthy interview about his transformational vision for Blueprint's future. The lobby screens cycled through images of him speaking at conferences, shaking hands with clients, standing in front of whiteboards covered with the kind of strategic diagrams that looked impressive, but said nothing. He'd even started a weekly, all-hands meeting called Blueprint Forward, where he shared insights about market disruption and competitive positioning that sounded suspiciously like the presentation materials Leona had developed for the Athena pitch. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon, when she found herself sitting in the executive conference room, listening to Jonas explain her own crisis management framework to a room full of senior staff. He'd renamed it Proactive Resilience, Architecture, and was presenting it as his approach to operational risk management, complete with a slide deck that reproduced her methodologies with stunning accuracy and zero attribution. The key insight, Jonas was saying, clicking through slides that contained her exact words rearranged into bullet points, is that true resilience isn't reactive. It's built into the system architecture from the beginning. We don't wait for problems to emerge. We anticipate them, prepare for them, and build our operational framework around the assumption that disruption is inevitable. Leona watched him present her life's work as his strategic innovation, watched the room nod appreciatively at insights she'd developed through years of trial and error, success and failure, 2 a.m. crisis calls, and weekend strategy sessions. The presentation was flawless, confident, compelling. It was also theft, dressed up in corporate legitimacy, and served with a side of plausible deniability. When the meeting ended, she stayed behind, ostensibly to clean up her notes, but really to process the full scope of what had just happened. Jonas noticed her lingering and approached with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he had no idea she'd just watched him steal her intellectual property. "Great session," he said, gathering his materials. "I think the team really got energized by the resilience framework. It's exactly the kind of systematic thinking that's going to drive our next phase of growth." "It's a solid framework," Leona agreed, her voice carefully neutral. "Whoever developed it clearly has a deep understanding of operational complexity." Something flickered in Jonas's expression. Not guilt exactly, but a momentary uncertainty, as if he was trying to gauge whether she was being sarcastic or simply supportive. "Yeah, absolutely. It's the kind of strategic thinking that emerges from really understanding the business at a foundational level." Foundational level? She almost laughed. The foundation was her, literally and figuratively. She'd built the systems he was now claiming credit for, developed the methodologies he was repackaging as innovation, created the operational excellence he was using as evidence of his leadership potential. But pointing that out would make her seem petty, proprietary, the kind of territorial thinking that didn't align with Blueprint's collaborative culture. So instead, she nodded politely and said, "I'm sure the clients will be impressed by the strategic coherence." That evening, Leona sat in her apartment, looking out at the Chicago skyline she'd helped Blueprint claim a piece of, and tried to calculate the exact weight of her own invisibility. 20 years of building something important, of creating value and solving problems and turning chaos into success. And what did she have to show for it? A comfortable salary, a nice office, and the growing realization that she'd been playing a game where the rules changed depending on who was keeping score. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eva Chen, Blueprint's head of design, and one of the few people at the company who still spoke to her like a human being rather than a corporate resource. "Drinks? I need to vent about the latest brilliant strategic initiative, and you're the only one who won't try to spin it as positive disruption." Leona smiled despite herself. At least she wasn't completely invisible. Not yet, anyway. The final straw wasn't dramatic. It never is, in the quiet violence of corporate indifference. It was a Tuesday morning email from Maya, marked urgent, with the kind of false breathlessness that had become Blueprint's signature communication style under Jonas's leadership. The subject line read, "Exciting opportunity, strategic support, initiative." Leona opened it while sipping her coffee, still in that liminal space between sleep and full consciousness, where bad news hasn't yet crystallized into anger. The email was a masterpiece of HR manipulation, 3 paragraphs of corporate speak that managed to sound like a promotion while actually being a demotion wrapped in strategic language. "Hi, Leona. Hope your week is off to a great start. I wanted to reach out about an exciting opportunity that's come up as part of our organizational optimization. Jonas has identified a critical need for senior strategic support on the client retention initiative, and your name immediately came to mind. This would be a chance to leverage your deep institutional knowledge in a consulting capacity, providing guidance and expertise to help our account management team navigate complex client relationships. The role would report directly to our new VP of Client Success. We're finalizing that hire next week, and would involve developing training materials, best practices documentation, and strategic frameworks that can be scaled across the organization. It's exactly the kind of high-impact knowledge transfer work that maximizes your unique value proposition while freeing you up from the day-to-day operational responsibilities that we know can be draining. Let's chat this afternoon about next. Steps and timeline. Leona read it twice, then set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone who was afraid she might throw it otherwise. Strategic support, consulting capacity, knowledge transfer, training materials. It was a beautiful euphemism for being systematically stripped of actual authority while being asked to document her own processes for someone else to inherit. She walked to her bathroom mirror and looked at herself. Really looked, the way you do when you're trying to recognize someone you used to know. 43 years old, graying at the temples in a way that made her look distinguished rather than tired, though tired was closer to the truth. Her reflection stared back with the expression of someone who'd spent 20 years being professionally diplomatic and was finally running out of diplomacy. The woman in the mirror had built Blueprint's operational excellence from nothing. She'd turned a chaotic startup into a billion-dollar company through sheer competence and strategic thinking. She'd mentored dozens of engineers, salvaged countless client relationships, and created systems that were still running the company's most critical functions. She'd given Blueprint everything: her time, her energy, her ideas, her loyalty, her identity. And now they wanted her to write the manual for her own replacement. Leona's phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's number, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail. Miguel Reyes had an uncomfortable talent for calling exactly when she was trying to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Mija, his voice carried the warmth of someone who'd learned to find joy in simple things. I was just thinking about you. How's work? It's fine, Poppy. Same as always. Same as always doesn't sound fine. You sound tired. Her father had emigrated from Cuba with nothing but engineering skills, and in stubborn refusal to accept other people's limitations as his own. He'd built a small but successful consulting practice by being indispensable to clients who needed someone who could solve problems no one else could solve. The irony wasn't lost on her. I am tired, she admitted. I think I'm tired of being useful. Ah, Miguel said, and she could hear the understanding in his voice. Useful to who? Everyone except myself. You know what I told you when you started that job? I said, Leona, don't build someone else's house so well that you forget to build your own. You remember that? She did remember, though she'd chosen to forget. It was easier to focus on the immediate satisfaction of solving problems, of being essential, of being the person everyone called when things went wrong. It was easier than asking whether being indispensable to others was the same thing as being valuable to herself. I remember. So what are you going to do about it? That afternoon, Leona opened her laptop and began typing, not training materials or strategic frameworks or best practices documentation. Instead, she opened a document she'd created years ago and never had the courage to complete. Saltcore Labs, Concept Framework. Saltcore had been her secret project, the thing she worked on during long flights and quiet weekends when she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to build something entirely her own. The name came from the geological concept of salt domes, stable, foundational structures that formed under pressure and created the foundation for everything above them. It was meant to be a consulting firm focused on operational architecture, the kind of systematic problem-solving that large organizations needed but rarely valued until everything was falling apart. She'd never pursued it because Blueprint needed her, because her salary was comfortable, because starting over at 43 seemed impossible. But sitting in her office, reading Maya's email for the third time, Leona realized that staying seemed impossible too. The resignation letter took her 20 minutes to write and 20 years to send. 2 sentences, professional and clean. Please. Accept this letter as formal notice of my resignation from Blueprint Dynamics, effective 2 weeks from today's date. I will ensure a smooth transition of my current responsibilities. She sent it at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, after everyone had left for the day. No drama, no confrontation, no explanation beyond what was legally required. Just a quiet exit from a company that had quietly erased her. Maya's response came within an hour. Hi, Leona. I received your resignation letter and wanted to reach out immediately. I'm surprised by this decision, especially given the exciting strategic support opportunity we discussed. Can we schedule a time to talk through any concerns you might have? I'd hate for this to be a knee-jerk reaction to what's really just a normal organizational transition. Let me know when you're available. Thanks. Leona read the email, then deleted it without responding. She packed her personal items, a coffee mug from her father, a photo from the Soul Project team, a small succulent plant that had somehow survived 20 years of corporate air conditioning. Everything else belonged to Blueprint, including the version of herself that had believed loyalty was a two-way street. Walking out of the building for the last time, Leona felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The strange lightness of someone who'd finally stopped carrying other people's weight. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time, in 20 years, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than failure. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Reyes, this is Silas Rayburn. I heard through the grapevine that you might be looking for new challenges. Would you be interested in coffee? I have a proposition that might interest you. Leona stared at the message. Silas Rayburn. She knew the name. Aerospace engineer, early Blueprint investor, someone who'd left the company years ago over strategic differences with the board. Someone who'd told her once, at a company party she'd almost forgotten, that she was too smart to spend her life making other people look good. She typed back, Coffee sounds good. When and where? The response came immediately. Tomorrow, $10. Dark matter coffee on Western. And Leona, bring your salt core notes. It's time to stop building other people's dreams. Leona stopped walking, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk as downtown Chicago moved around her. Somehow, Silas knew about Salt Core. Somehow, he'd been watching. Somehow, her quiet exit had been noticed by someone who mattered. For the first time in months, Leona Reyes smiled. Dark matter coffee occupied the kind of converted warehouse space that Chicago did better than anywhere else. Exposed brick, industrial lighting, and the persistent smell of roasted beans mixed with the metallic tang of ambition. Leona arrived 10 minutes early, a habit 20 years in corporate America had beaten into her DNA, and found Silas Rayburn already waiting at a corner table, reading what looked like a technical journal while nursing black coffee from a ceramic mug. He looked exactly as she remembered from Blueprint's early days, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of weathered confidence that came from building things that actually worked. Silas had been one of Blueprint's first investors, back when the company operated out of a converted garage and Richard Brennan still answered his own phone. He'd left the board 5 years ago after what the official press release called strategic differences regarding long-term vision, which everyone understood meant he'd told them they were idiots and walked away with his dignity intact. Leona? He stood as she approached, extending a hand that was calloused in a way that suggested he still built things himself. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, she admitted, settling into the chair across from him. Your text mentioned Salt Core. I'm curious how you know about that. Silas smiled, the expression of someone who enjoyed being underestimated. You presented the initial concept at the 2019 Innovation Symposium. Internal presentation, maybe? 20 people in the room. You called it Foundational Architecture for Operational Resilience. I was sitting in the back, taking notes. Leona felt a flush of embarrassment. She'd forgotten about that presentation. It was supposed to be a brainstorming session, a safe space to float half-formed ideas without judgment. She'd spent months developing the SALT core framework in her spare time, and when Richard had asked for innovative thinking about Blueprint's future capabilities, she'd foolishly believed he wanted actual innovation rather than performative creativity. That was 6 years ago, she said, and it went nowhere. It went nowhere because it threatened the existing power structure, Silas corrected. You were proposing a fundamentally different approach to client relationships, one where operational excellence became the differentiator rather than just the foundation. Richard and the board weren't ready for that kind of thinking. And now? Now you're not asking permission. Silas leaned forward, his expression serious. I've been watching Blueprint since I left, Leona. Watching the decisions they make, the talent they waste, the opportunities they miss because they're too busy managing perception to focus on performance. What happened to you was inevitable. Not because you weren't good enough, but because you were too good. You made everyone else look ordinary. The words hit harder than they should have. For 20 years, Leona had told herself that success was about fitting in, about being valuable without being threatening. She'd made herself essential while carefully avoiding being ambitious, strategic while never appearing competitive. She'd played by rules that were designed to keep her exactly where she was. So what are you proposing? She asked. I'm proposing we stop pretending that loyalty to incompetent leadership is a virtue. Silas pulled out a tablet and opened what looked like a business plan. I've been developing a portfolio of mid-stage companies that need exactly what you do. Operational transformation, systematic problem-solving, the kind of strategic thinking that actually creates value rather than just managing it. I want to fund SALT core labs and I want you to run it. Leona stared at the screen, scanning financial projections and market analysis that looked suspiciously thorough for a spontaneous coffee meeting. You've been planning this. I've been hoping for this. There's a difference. Silas scrolled through slides that outlined everything from initial funding to client acquisition strategy. The market is ready, Leona. Companies are finally realizing that operational excellence isn't a nice-to-have. It's the only sustainable competitive advantage. But most consulting firms are run by people who've never actually built anything. They can diagnose problems, but they can't architect solutions. You can. And you think I'm ready to be the face of a company? I think you've been the face of Blueprint for years. They just never put your name on the marketing materials. The conversation continued for 2 hours, ranging from technical capabilities to client development strategy to the kind of company, culture that would attract the talent SALT core would need. Silas had done his homework. He knew which Blueprint clients were dissatisfied with the new leadership, which market segments were underserved by existing consultancies, which operational challenges were creating billion-dollar opportunities for companies smart enough to solve them. More importantly, he understood something about Leona that she was only beginning to understand about herself. She wasn't just good at fixing other people's problems. She was good at seeing systems that didn't exist yet, at imagining solutions that no one else had considered, at building frameworks that could scale beyond their original parameters. She was, in short, exactly the kind of strategic thinker who should be running companies rather than just supporting them. The seed funding is already committed, Silas said as they prepared to leave. $2 million to start, with additional rounds, based on performance milestones. I've identified office space in Pilsen. Nothing fancy, but functional. And I have 3 potential clients who are ready to sign contracts as soon as you're ready to take meetings. 3 clients? 3 clients who specifically asked for you when they found out you'd left Blueprint. Word travels fast in this industry, especially when someone with your reputation becomes available. Leona felt something shift inside. Her chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. For 20 years, she'd been told that her value lay in supporting other people's visions. The possibility that clients might seek her out specifically, that her reputation existed independent of Blueprint's brand, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I need time to think about this," she said. "Of course, but don't think too long. Every day you wait is another day those clients are looking for alternatives." Silas handed her a business card that contained nothing but his name and phone number. "Call me when you're ready to stop being indispensable to other people and start being essential to yourself." That evening, Leona sat in her apartment with a legal pad and a bottle of wine, trying to calculate the exact weight of possibility. On one side of the ledger, a comfortable severance package, job security at any number of established firms, the safe path of leveraging her experience into a senior role somewhere else. On the other side, the terrifying freedom of building something, entirely her own, the possibility of failure, the chance that 20 years of playing it safe had actually made her risk-averse rather than strategic. She opened her laptop and scrolled through the SALT core framework she'd developed years ago. The ideas were still good, better than good. They were the kind of systematic solutions that could transform how companies approached operational challenges. But ideas were easy, implementation was hard, leadership was harder. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eva Chen. "Heard through the grapevine that you're exploring new opportunities. If you're building something, I want in. This place has gone completely insane since you left." Leona stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the implications fully registered. Eva Chen was Blueprint's most innovative designer, the kind of creative problem solver who could turn abstract concepts into concrete solutions. She was also notoriously particular about the projects she worked on and the people she worked with. If Ava was interested in jumping ship, Leona picked up Silas's business card and dialed his number. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said by way of greeting. "I want to see the office space," Leona said, "and I want to meet those 3 clients. How's tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow morning is perfect." After she hung up, Leona returned to her legal pad and wrote a single line at the top of the page. SALT Core Labs, Operational Architecture for Systematic Excellence. Below it, she began sketching the organizational structure for a company that didn't exist yet, but suddenly felt inevitable. For the first time in 20 years, Leona Reyes was building something for herself. The Pilsen office space was perfect in the way that only imperfect things could be. A 3rd-floor loft in a converted manufacturing building with exposed brick walls, industrial windows that actually opened, and enough square footage for a team of 12 if they ever got that big. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was walkable, and most importantly, it felt nothing like Blueprint's sterile corporate headquarters with their motivational posters and carefully curated innovation zones. The previous tenant was a ceramics studio, Silas explained as they walked through the empty space. "They left the sink stations, which we can convert to coffee prep areas. The lighting is excellent, north-facing windows, minimal glare. And there's a loading dock if we ever need to move equipment." Leona moved through the space slowly, visualizing how it could work. Open floor plan for collaboration, but with enough nooks and corners for focused individual work. A conference area that felt more like a living room than a boardroom. Whiteboards everywhere, because the best solutions always emerged from messy thinking made visible. It was the anti-blueprint, and that felt exactly right. "When can we move in?" she asked. "Lease is ready to sign whenever you are." The landlord is a former engineer. He likes tenants who actually build things. Within a week, SALT Core Labs had transformed from concept to reality. Leona signed the lease on a Wednesday, bought furniture from a going-out-of-business office supply store on Thursday, and spent the weekend setting up workstations with the methodical precision that had made her indispensable at Blueprint. Eva. Chen arrived Monday morning with a truck full of design equipment and the kind of infectious enthusiasm that Leona had forgotten was possible in professional environments. "This feels like actually building something," Eva said, arranging her monitors in a corner station that caught the morning light, instead of just managing the slow decay of someone else's vision. They were joined by Marcus Webb, a former Blueprint project manager who'd been quietly blacklisted after questioning one of Jonas's strategic initiatives, and Priya Patel, a data analyst who'd left the company the same week as Leona for reasons no one discussed but everyone understood. 4 people, $2 million in seed funding, and the kind of collective competence that had once made Blueprint profitable before profit became secondary to performance metrics. The first client meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. Daryl Nguyen from Solara Tech had reached out through back channels, ostensibly for informal consultation, but really because Solara Tech's operational efficiency had dropped 30% since Blueprint's new leadership had taken over their account. Daryl was the kind of procurement director who cared more about results than relationships, which made him exactly the kind of client Saltcore needed. "Before we start," Daryl said, settling into one of the refurbished conference chairs, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not here because I'm unhappy with Blueprint. I'm here because the Blueprint I contracted with doesn't exist anymore." Leona nodded. She'd expected this, the careful diplomacy of clients who needed solutions, but couldn't afford to burn bridges with established vendors. "We understand. What specific challenges are you facing?" For the next hour, Daryl outlined problems that were painfully familiar: process documentation that existed but wasn't being followed, efficiency metrics that looked good on paper but didn't reflect operational reality, and a growing disconnect between strategic planning and tactical execution. They were Blueprint problems, the kind that emerged when leadership focused on vision statements instead of systematic implementation. "The frustrating thing," Daryl continued, "is that we had solutions for all of this. There were frameworks, processes, escalation procedures, but somehow they've been optimized away." Eva and Leona exchanged glances. They knew exactly what had happened to those frameworks. They'd been rebranded as legacy thinking and replaced with more agile approaches that sounded innovative but lacked the systematic rigor that made operational excellence possible. "What would success look like for you?" Leona asked. "Honestly, I want my efficiency numbers back. But more than that, I want to work with people who understand that operational excellence isn't just about having good systems, it's about having systems that actually work under pressure." The proposal took 3 days to develop, but it was unlike anything Leona had created at Blueprint. Instead of glossy presentations full of theoretical frameworks, Saltcore delivered a technical assessment that diagnosed specific problems and proposed concrete solutions. Instead of timeline projections based on best-case scenarios, they provided realistic milestones with built-in contingencies. Instead of promising transformation, they offered improvement, measurable, sustainable, and grounded in operational reality rather than strategic aspiration. Solara Tech signed the contract on Friday afternoon. "This feels different," Eva said as they walked back from the client meeting. "At Blueprint, it always felt like we were selling hope. This feels like we're selling competence." The second client came through Hassan Malik, who'd reached out through encrypted messaging with the paranoid caution of someone who understood the professional risks of preparing and narrating this story. "Took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Being associated with Blueprint defectors. Hassan hadn't left the company yet, but he'd been quietly documenting the operational disasters that followed Jonas's strategic initiatives. The data he shared was damning: cost overruns, timeline slippages, client satisfaction scores that were trending downward despite aggressive PR campaigns claiming the opposite. "I can't be publicly associated with this," Hassan said during their clandestine coffee meeting. "But I know 3 companies that are looking for alternatives. Companies that are willing to pay premium rates for the kind of systematic problem-solving that Blueprint used to provide." Used to provide? Before they decided that 20 years of institutional knowledge was less valuable than 6 months of venture capital connections. The third client was the most surprising. A federal innovation task force that was evaluating operational architecture proposals for a next-generation logistics initiative. The project was worth 8 figures over 3 years, exactly the kind of high-profile government contract that established companies fought over. The fact that Saltcore had been invited to bid was either a bureaucratic oversight or evidence that Leona's reputation extended further than she'd realized. "How did we get on their vendor list?" Marcus asked as they prepared for the initial presentation. "Someone recommended us," Leona said, though she wasn't entirely sure who. The procurement officer had been vague about their selection process, mentioning only that Saltcore's approach to systematic operational architecture had been specifically requested by someone in the evaluation committee. The government presentation was scheduled for the following month, which gave them time to develop the kind of comprehensive proposal that could establish Saltcore as a serious player, rather than just a Blueprint alternative. But even before that meeting, the company was gaining momentum. Word was spreading through Chicago's engineering community, quietly, carefully, but persistently. Saltcore Labs was the place where competent people went when they got tired of making incompetent. Leadership looked good. By the end of their first month, they had 3 signed contracts, 2 pending proposals, and a waiting list of potential team members who were interested in jumping ship from various corporate environments. The office that had felt too big now felt almost cramped, and Leona found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, planning for growth rather than just managing decline. "We're going to need more space," Eva observed, looking around the increasingly crowded loft. "We're going to need a lot of things," Leona replied. "But first, we need to prove that we can deliver on what we promised." That evening, alone in the office after everyone else had gone home, Leona stood at the windows looking out at Chicago's skyline. Somewhere in that forest of glass and steel, Jonas was probably working late in the Blueprint headquarters, trying to solve problems with frameworks that Leona had developed but could no longer claim credit for. Somewhere else, Hassan was documenting the slow collapse of operational systems that had taken decades to build and months to destroy. But here, in this converted manufacturing loft in Pilsen, something new was emerging. Not a reaction to blueprints, failures, but a positive assertion of what operational excellence could look like when it was built by people who actually understood how systems worked. For the first time in 20 years, Leona Reyes was building something that bore her signature, literally and figuratively. Her phone buzzed with a text from Silas. "How does it feel to be essential to yourself?" Leona smiled and typed back, "Like I should have done this 20 years ago." "Maybe," came the reply. "But you're doing it now. That's what matters." Outside, Chicago glittered with the lights of 1,000 ambitions, and for the first time in her life, one of them belonged entirely to her. The first sign of trouble at Blueprint came disguised as a victory celebration. Jonas had called an all-hands meeting to announce that the company had been selected as a finalist for the McKenna Industries Modernization Project, a potential $200 million contract that would solidify Blueprint's position in the industrial automation space. The conference room buzzed with the kind of forced enthusiasm that corporate culture demanded, but Hassan Malik noticed what others missed. The timeline was impossible, the scope was underspecified, and the budget assumptions were based on operational efficiencies that Blueprint could no longer deliver. "This is exactly the kind of transformational opportunity that validates our strategic pivot," Jonas announced, clicking through slides that looked impressive but felt hollow. "McKenna Industries wants a partner who can think beyond traditional consulting models, someone who can architect solutions, not just optimize existing systems." Hassan scribbled notes in the margin of his portfolio, calculating resource requirements against current capacity. The numbers didn't add up. Since Leona's departure, Blueprint had lost two other senior operations specialists. Eva Chen had taken half the design team's institutional knowledge with her, and the systematic problem-solving frameworks that had made the company's reputation were gradually being replaced with more agile approaches that prioritized speed over sustainability. The presentation is scheduled for next month, Jonas continued, and I'm confident we're going to show McKenna exactly why Blueprint is the right choice for their future. After the meeting, Hassan lingered in the conference room, ostensibly reviewing his notes, but actually processing the implications of what he'd just heard. McKenna Industries wasn't just any client. They were notoriously demanding, with a reputation for firing consulting firms that overpromised and underdelivered. If Blueprint fumbled this opportunity, it wouldn't just be a lost contract. It would be a very public demonstration that the company's operational capabilities no longer matched their marketing claims. Hassan, got a minute? Maya Foster appeared. In the doorway with her signature smile, the one that usually preceded uncomfortable conversations. I wanted to get your perspective on resource allocation for the McKenna project. What kind of perspective? Well, Jonas is excited about the opportunity, but he's also realistic about the technical complexity. We're going to need someone with deep operational knowledge to help develop the proposal framework. Hassan felt a familiar chill. Resource allocation, technical complexity, proposal framework. It was the same euphemistic language Maya had used when she'd asked Leona to provide strategic support for Jonas's initiatives. What are you asking? We want you to lead the technical development team, full authority over methodology, timeline, and implementation strategy. It would be a chance to really showcase your capabilities. Full authority. Hassan almost laughed at the absurdity. Full authority meant full responsibility when things went wrong, but Jonas would still be the one presenting to clients and taking credit for successful outcomes. It was the same trap Leona had navigated for 20 years, essential, but invisible, accountable but not empowered. I'll think about it, Hassan said. Of course, but don't think too long. We need to move quickly on this one. That evening, Hassan sat in his home office reviewing Blueprint's financial performance over the past 6 months. The numbers told a story that contradicted Jonas's optimistic presentations. Client retention was down 12%, project completion times had increased by an average of 6 weeks, and customer satisfaction scores were trending steadily downward. More importantly, 3 major clients had quietly declined to renew their annual contracts, citing concerns about operational consistency. Hassan had been tracking these metrics privately, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly out of the growing suspicion that Blueprint was heading toward a crisis that leadership either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. Jonas's strategic initiatives looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations, but they were built on foundations that were quietly crumbling. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. The McKenna project isn't what you think it is. Coffee tomorrow if you want to know why. Hassan stared at the message, recognizing the communication style even though he couldn't identify the sender. Someone with inside knowledge, someone who understood that McKenna Industries represented more than just a business opportunity. Someone who might have insights that Blueprint's leadership was missing. The next morning, he found himself at a coffee shop in Logan Square, sitting across from Leona Reyes for the first time since her departure. She looked different, more relaxed, less diplomatically careful, but with an intensity that suggested she was operating at full capacity rather than the strategic restraint that had characterized her Blueprint years. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," Hassan admitted. "But that message got my attention. McKenna Industries has been shopping for operational consultants for 8 months. They've interviewed 6 firms, including Blueprint twice. They're not looking for strategic vision or transformational thinking. They're looking for someone who can fix a supply chain crisis that's costing them $3 million per month. Hassan felt something cold settle in his stomach. How do you know this? Because they approached Saltcore 3 weeks ago. We turned them down. You turned down a $200 million contract? We turned down a $200 million disaster. McKenna's problems aren't operational, they're systemic. Their entire procurement framework is built around cost optimization models that worked in 2015 but are completely inappropriate for current supply chain realities. Fixing their immediate crisis would require rebuilding their foundational architecture, which would take 18 months and cost twice what they've budgeted. Leona pulled out a tablet and showed Hassan a technical assessment that was more thorough than anything Blueprint had produced for the project. McKenna Industries doesn't want to hear that their problems are architectural. They want someone to promise quick fixes and efficiency gains. Blueprint is going to promise exactly that. And when they can't deliver, McKenna will fire them, publicly, probably with enough detail to damage Blueprint's reputation with other manufacturing clients. Jonas will blame operational failures, which means he'll blame the people who tried to implement his strategic vision. Hassan studied the assessment, recognizing the kind of systematic analysis that had once been Blueprint's signature capability. Why are you telling me this? Because you're still there. Because you understand how these systems actually work. And because when this project fails, you're going to be the one they blame. The conversation continued for an hour, ranging from technical specifics to industry dynamics to the broader implications of Blueprint's strategic direction. Leona wasn't trying to recruit him, at least not directly. She was simply sharing information that Hassan needed to make informed decisions about his own professional future. There's something else, Leona said as they prepared to leave. Blueprint isn't the only company McKenna approached. They also reached out to 3 other firms, including TechFlow Solutions and Meridian Consulting. All of them turned down the project for the same reasons we did. Which means Blueprint is competing against firms that don't actually want to win. McKenna is going to select Blueprint because they're the only ones naive enough to think this project is achievable under the proposed parameters. Hassan walked back to Blueprint's offices with the weight of uncomfortable knowledge settling around his shoulders. He'd always prided himself on being analytical, on making decisions based on data rather than emotion. The data was clear. McKenna Industries was a trap, and Blueprint was walking into it with the kind of confident blindness that came from strategic thinking divorced from operational reality. That afternoon, he found himself in Jonas's office, ostensibly to discuss resource allocation for the McKenna proposal, but really to gauge whether leadership understood what they were committing to. Hassan, perfect timing, Jonas said, gesturing to a whiteboard covered with organizational charts and timeline projections. I've been thinking about team structure for McKenna. We're going to need our best people on this one. Have we completed a technical assessment of their current systems? Maya's team is handling the preliminary analysis. But honestly, I'm not too worried about the technical details. McKenna chose us because they trust our strategic approach. Hassan felt a familiar chill. Technical details. As if operational complexity was just a minor implementation challenge, rather than the core of what consulting firms were supposed to solve. What if the technical details indicate that their timeline isn't realistic? Jonas waved dismissively. That's exactly the kind of legacy thinking that holds companies back. McKenna doesn't want consultants who tell them why things can't be done. They want partners who figure out how to make things work. That evening, Hassan opened his laptop and began drafting a detailed technical memorandum outlining the risks associated with the McKenna project. He documented the supply chain complexities, the architectural challenges, and the resource requirements that would be necessary for successful implementation. It was the kind of systematic analysis that Blueprint had once valued, the kind of careful planning that prevented expensive failures. He never sent the memo. By the time he finished writing it, Hassan realized that Blueprint's leadership didn't want analysis. They wanted validation. They'd already decided to pursue McKenna Industries, and any data that contradicted that decision would be dismissed as pessimistic thinking or resistance to change. Instead, he saved the document to an encrypted drive and began preparing for the inevitable moment when Blueprint would need someone to blame for McKenna's failure. Because the failure was coming, not because Hassan wanted it to happen, but because the data made it unavoidable. 3 days later, Jonas announced that Blueprint had been selected as McKenna Industries' consulting partner. The all-hands meeting was celebratory, full of congratulations and strategic optimism. Hassan participated appropriately, smiled at the right moments, and began quietly documenting every decision that would eventually need to be explained to very unhappy clients. For the first time in his career, Hassan Malik found himself hoping his own analysis was wrong. The HelixNet conference room smelled like fresh coffee and possibility, the kind of clean, modern space where decisions worth millions of dollars happened between polite handshakes and carefully modulated presentations. Leona arrived 15 minutes early, a habit that had served her well at Blueprint and served her even better now that punctuality was a choice rather than a corporate requirement. She'd learned to use those extra minutes not for last-minute preparation, but for reading the room, understanding the dynamics that would determine whether technical competence or strategic theater would win the day. HelixNet's procurement team was refreshingly straightforward. 3 executives who'd built their careers solving actual problems rather than managing perception. Sarah Martinez, their COO, had the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough consulting presentations to recognize substance from elaborate packaging. David Chen, their head of operations, took notes in the margins of their proposal with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. And Rebecca Foster, their CEO, had the reputation of someone who fired consultants for promising transformations they couldn't deliver. Blueprint presented first, which gave Saltcore the advantage of response rather than speculation. Leona watched Jonas perform his strategic theater through the glass conference room walls, gesturing confidently at slides that looked impressive from a distance. His team was larger, 6 people compared to Saltcore's 3, and their presentation materials had the kind of glossy perfection that came from dedicated marketing budgets and professional design teams. When Jonas finished, the HelixNet executives exchanged glances that Leona recognized from 20 years of client meetings. Polite interest masking deep skepticism, the kind of diplomatic non-reaction that preceded difficult questions. "Mr. Coyle," Sarah Martinez said, "your strategic framework is certainly comprehensive, but we're curious about implementation specifics. How would you address our current bottleneck in the Denver distribution hub?" Jonas paused, not the confident pause of someone organizing complex thoughts, but the uncertain hesitation of someone who hadn't anticipated operational details. That's exactly the kind of challenge where our systematic approach creates value. We'd conduct a comprehensive analysis of your current workflows and develop optimization strategies that align with your broader transformation objectives. Rebecca. Foster leaned forward slightly. "Can you be more specific? The Denver bottleneck is costing us $400,000 per month. What would your first 90 days look like?" "Well, obviously we'd need to conduct detailed stakeholder interviews and process mapping before recommending specific interventions." Leona felt Eva tense beside her. They both recognized what was happening. Jonas was defaulting to consulting speak because he didn't actually understand HelixNet's operational challenges. He was selling process rather than solutions, methodology rather than outcomes. When Saltcore's turn came, Leona opened not with strategic vision but with a question. "Before we talk about what we'd do, can you walk us through exactly what happens when a shipment hits the Denver hub? Start to finish, including the failure points you've identified." For the next 20 minutes, HelixNet's team described their operational reality with the relief of clients who finally had permission to discuss actual problems rather than strategic aspirations. Leona listened. Eva sketched workflow diagrams in real time, and Marcus calculated resource implications on his tablet. By the time they finished talking, SaltCore had a functional understanding of HelixNet's system architecture that Blueprint's six-person team had never bothered to develop. "Here's what we see," Leona said, Eva's diagrams now displayed on the room's screen. "Your Denver bottleneck isn't a process problem. It's a data problem. Your inventory management system updates every 4 hours, but your shipping decisions are made in real time. You're optimizing workflows based on information that's already obsolete." David Chen stopped taking notes and stared at the diagram. "How did you identify that?" "Because we asked about failure points instead of assuming we knew what success should look like." Eva walked them through a proposed solution that was surgical rather than comprehensive, targeted rather than transformational. Instead of promising to rebuild HelixNet's entire operational framework, SaltCore offered to solve their immediate crisis while building capabilities for future challenges. Instead of 18-month transformation timelines, they proposed a 6-week pilot program with measurable outcomes and clear success metrics. "This is refreshing," Rebecca Foster said when they finished. "Most consultants want to sell us new problems to justify bigger solutions. You're actually trying to solve the problems we already have." The contract negotiation took 3 days, not because the terms were complex, but because HelixNet's legal team couldn't quite believe that SaltCore's proposal was as straightforward as it appeared. No hidden fees, no scope creep provisions, no elaborate change management frameworks. Just competent people solving defined problems for agreed-upon compensation. When the signed contract arrived via email, Eva printed it out and taped it to the office wall, not as decoration, but as evidence. Proof that clients would choose substance over style when given the option. Proof that 20 years of operational excellence hadn't been wasted, just temporarily misdirected. "Think Jonas knows yet?" Marcus asked, watching the HelixNet announcement go live on their company website. "He'll know soon enough," Leona replied. "Word travels fast when clients start choosing competence over charisma." Outside, Chicago's afternoon light filtered through industrial windows, illuminating a space that felt more like a workshop than a corporate office. For the first time since leaving Blueprint, Leona allowed herself to believe that SaltCore wasn't just a reaction to betrayal. It was a demonstration of what consulting could look like when it was built by people who actually knew how to build things. The phone calls started the day after HelixNet's announcement went public. Not sales calls or congratulatory messages, but something more valuable. Quiet inquiries from procurement directors who'd worked with Leona during her Blueprint years. Tentative outreach from executives who'd been disappointed by their recent consulting experiences, and, most significantly, formal RFP invitations from companies that had never heard of SaltCore 6 months ago, but suddenly wanted to understand what operational architecture actually meant. Leona fielded these calls with the same diplomatic care she'd once used to manage Blueprint's client relationships, but with a crucial difference. She was no longer translating someone else's vision or apologizing for someone else's failures. When Meridian Logistics asked about supply chain optimization, she could discuss implementation timelines without worrying about whether her estimates aligned with marketing promises. When TechFlow Industries wanted to understand systematic problem-solving, she could describe methodologies she'd actually developed rather than frameworks she'd been asked to execute. The most surprising call came from Daryl Nguyen at Solara Tech, who'd been quietly evaluating SaltCore's work since their first engagement. 3 months earlier. "Leona, I need to ask you something directly," Daryl said during what was supposed to be a routine check-in call. "Are you taking on clients that compete with Blueprint?" "We're taking on clients who need operational consulting," Leona replied, carefully. "Why?" "Because Blueprint just pitched us on expanding our contract, and honestly, Their proposal looks like something you would have written 2 years ago. Same methodology, same framework, even some of the same language. But when I asked technical questions, their team couldn't answer them. Leona felt a familiar chill. She'd expected Jonas to appropriate her work. That was inevitable when someone with shallow expertise tried to manage complex client relationships. But she hadn't anticipated that he'd be sloppy enough to present outdated methodologies to clients who understood current operational challenges. What kind of questions? Supply chain resilience under inflationary pressure, risk modeling for distributed manufacturing, the kind of stuff you used to handle without breaking a sweat. Their lead consultant kept talking about framework optimization and systematic integration, but couldn't explain how those concepts applied to our specific situation. And I'm wondering if Saltcore would be interested in taking over the entire Solaritech account? The conversation continued for 30 minutes, but Leona already knew how it would end. Solaritech wasn't just dissatisfied with Blueprint's recent performance. They were actively looking for alternatives. More importantly, they were willing to pay premium rates for the kind of operational expertise that actually solved problems rather than just managing them. Within a week, 2 more Blueprint clients had made similar inquiries. Not dramatic defections or public announcements of dissatisfaction, but quiet explorations of alternatives. Companies that had trusted Blueprint's brand but were increasingly frustrated by the gap between marketing promises and operational delivery. Meanwhile, Hassan Malik had been documenting Blueprint's deteriorating client relationships with the systematic precision of someone who understood that organizational failures followed predictable patterns. His encrypted updates to Leona had become more frequent and more detailed, painting a picture of a company that was managing perception rather than performance. McKenna Industries is 3 weeks behind schedule, Hassan reported during one of their clandestine coffee meetings. Jonas keeps telling them it's because we're being thorough, but really it's because we don't have anyone who understands their manufacturing processes well enough to develop realistic solutions. What about Maya's team? They were supposed to handle technical analysis. Maya's team can generate reports, but they can't architect systems. They're documenting problems without understanding why those problems exist or how to fix them. Hassan's updates revealed a company in systematic decline, not the dramatic collapse that made headlines, but the gradual erosion of capabilities that preceded more visible failures. Client satisfaction scores continued dropping, project timelines were consistently missed, and Blueprint's most experienced consultants were quietly exploring opportunities elsewhere. "There's something else," Hassan said, lowering his voice even though they were sitting in a crowded cafe where no one could possibly overhear corporate gossip. Jonas contacted Silas Rayburn last week, tried to convince him to stop funding. Saltcore. What did Silas say? According to the voicemail Jonas left for the board, which I may have accidentally overheard, Silas told him that funding competent people was better business than subsidizing incompetent leadership. Leona almost smiled at that. Silas had never been diplomatic when he encountered stupidity, which was one of the reasons Blueprint's board had been happy to see him leave. How did Jonas respond? "He's convinced that you're stealing Blueprint's intellectual property. Keeps talking about proprietary methodologies and competitive sabotage. Proprietary methodologies that I developed. Try explaining that to someone who thinks innovation means rebranding other people's work." The conversation ended with Hassan's usual warning about professional discretion and plausible deniability, but Leona could sense something shifting in his tone. Not quite commitment to leaving Blueprint, but definitely movement away from loyalty to incompetent leadership. That evening, as Leona reviewed Saltcore's project pipeline, now extending 6 months into the future with a waiting list of potential clients, she realized that the cascade had become irreversible. Not because she'd planned it that way, but because competence created its own momentum once clients had permission to choose substance over style. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eva. Federal Procurement Office called, They want to schedule our presentation for the Innovation Task Force contract. Leona stared at the message, calculating implications. The federal contract was worth $15 million over 3 years. Exactly the kind of high-profile government project that established consulting firms as serious players rather than just blueprint alternatives. It was also the project that Jonas had been courting for months, confident that Blueprint's brand recognition would overcome any concerns about operational capabilities. She typed back, "When?" "Next month, same week Blueprint is presenting." Perfect, because sometimes the best revenge wasn't planning elaborate schemes or public confrontations. Sometimes it was simply being better at the work that everyone claimed to value and letting competence speak for itself. The Federal Innovation Task Force occupied a conference room that looked like it had been designed by people who understood that serious work required serious spaces. No motivational posters, no branded coffee mugs, just clean lines, functional furniture, and the kind of institutional gravity that came from making decisions about how taxpayer money got spent. Leona arrived 20 minutes early and used the extra time to review not her own presentation materials, but the procurement requirements that would determine whether technical competence or strategic vision won the day. Angela Caro, the task force director, had the reputation of someone who'd spent 30 years in federal acquisition and had developed sophisticated allergies to consulting firms that promised transformation but delivered disappointment. Her team included representatives from 3 agencies, 2 oversight committees, and the kind of technical specialists who could distinguish between operational frameworks that worked and marketing presentations that looked good. Blueprint presented first, which meant Leona could watch Jonas perform his strategic theater from the hallway through conference room windows that revealed more than they concealed. His team was impressive. 8 people in matching business attire, presentation materials that looked like they'd been produced by professional marketing teams, and the kind of confident energy that came from never having to implement the solutions they proposed. Jonas opened with his signature approach: broad strategic vision supported by impressive-looking frameworks that promised systematic transformation of federal logistics capabilities. He spoke confidently about paradigm shifts and operational synergy, using language that sounded authoritative, but said nothing specific about how actual problems would be solved. Leona watched Angela Caro's expression during the presentation, the kind of diplomatic attention that masked deep skepticism. When Jonas finished his overview and invited questions, the task force's technical specialists began probing for implementation details that revealed the gap between Blueprint's strategic confidence and operational competence. "Mr. Coyle," Angela said, "your framework for distributed logistics optimization looks comprehensive. Can you walk us through how this would apply to our current challenge with cross-agency inventory coordination?" Jonas paused, the same uncertain hesitation Leona had witnessed at HelixNet. That's exactly the kind of complex challenge where our systematic approach creates maximum value. We'd begin with comprehensive stakeholder analysis and develop integration strategies that align with your broader modernization objectives. Can you be more specific? We have 14 agencies using 12 different inventory systems. What would your implementation timeline look like? Obviously, we'd need to conduct detailed requirements analysis before recommending specific technical interventions. Leona recognized the pattern, Jonas defaulting to process language when he couldn't discuss operational specifics. He was selling methodology rather than solutions, promising analysis rather than outcomes. When Blueprint's presentation ended, Angela Caro announced a brief recess before SaltCore's session. Leona used the 15 minutes to review her materials, one final time, but really to center herself in the same calm focus that had served her through 20 years of client crises. "Ms. Reyes," Angela said as SaltCore's presentation began, "we've reviewed your proposal, and frankly, it's refreshingly direct. But we're curious about implementation specifics. Our cross-agency inventory challenge has defeated 3 consulting firms over the past 2 years. What makes you think your approach will succeed where others have failed?" Because we're not trying to transform your inventory systems, Leona replied. We're trying to solve your coordination problems. For the next 30 minutes, Leona walked the task force through an operational analysis that focused on practical solutions rather than theoretical frameworks. Instead of promising to integrate 14 different systems, SaltCore proposed creating coordination protocols that allowed existing systems to communicate effectively. Instead of 18-month transformation timelines, they outlined a phased implementation that would deliver measurable improvements within 90 days. IVA presented technical diagrams that illustrated how their coordination protocols would work in practice, using real examples from similar challenges they'd solved for private sector clients. Marcus outlined resource requirements and cost structures, with the precision of someone who understood that federal budgets required justification rather than aspiration. When they finished, Angela Caro leaned back in her chair with an expression Leona had learned to recognize over 2 decades of client presentations. The relief of procurement professionals who'd finally encountered consultants who understood the difference between selling hope and delivering competence. This is refreshing, Angela said. Most firms want to sell us complete system overhauls. You're actually addressing the problems we asked you to solve. The Q&A session continued for another hour, ranging from technical specifications to risk management to the kind of contingency planning that government contracts required. Leona answered each question with the systematic precision that had made her indispensable at Blueprint, but with a crucial difference. She was no longer translating someone else's vision or apologizing for someone else's limitations. When the session ended, Angela Caro walked SaltCore to the elevator with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested decisions had already been made. Ms. Reyes, I have to ask, did you develop these coordination protocols during your time at Blueprint? I developed the foundational concepts there, Leona replied carefully, but the specific implementation framework is entirely new. Good. Because Blueprint approached us 6 months ago with what looked like very similar methodologies, but they couldn't answer basic technical questions about implementation. The elevator arrived, and as the doors opened, Angela handed Leona a leather portfolio. The award notification is confidential until we complete the formal announcement process. But I wanted you to know that the task force was unanimous in our decision. Leona accepted the portfolio without opening it, though she could guess its contents. Thank you. No, Ms. Reyes. Thank you. It's unusual to encounter consulting proposals that focus on solving problems rather than selling solutions. As the elevator descended, Leona finally opened the portfolio and found the contract award letter that made SaltCore Labs a federally recognized consulting partner. $15 million over 3 years, with performance bonuses tied to measurable outcomes rather than strategic milestones. Eva read the letter over her shoulder and whispered, "Holy shit." "Language," Leona replied, but she was smiling. Outside the federal building, Marcus checked his phone and looked up with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Jonas, just called an emergency board meeting. Apparently, there's been unexpected developments in the federal procurement process." Leona imagined Jonas receiving the news that SaltCore had won a contract he'd been courting for months, trying to explain to Blueprint's board how a 4-person startup had outmaneuvered an established firm with 60 employees and $1 million marketing budget. But that was Jonas's problem now. Leona had spent 20 years solving other people's problems. Today, for the first time, she'd solved her own. The new office space in Pilsen had evolved organically over 8 months, transforming from an empty industrial loft into something that felt more like a laboratory than a consulting firm. Exposed brick walls displayed whiteboards covered with operational diagrams, client timelines, and the kind of systematic thinking that made complex problems solvable. The conference area still felt more like a living room than a boardroom, which was exactly how Leona wanted it. A space where clients could discuss actual challenges rather than performing strategic theater. Sunlight streamed through north-facing windows onto her desk, where the federal contract award letter sat in a simple black frame, not as decoration, but as evidence, proof that competence could compete with charisma when clients had permission to choose substance over style. The signature at the bottom of that letter, Leona Reyes, founder and chief executive officer, Salt Core Labs, represented something she'd never allowed herself to imagine during 20 years of making other people's visions possible. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. Hassan Malik, writing from his personal account with the subject line, "Thank you." "Leona," the message began. "I submitted my resignation from Blueprint this morning." Jonas responded by accusing me of corporate espionage and threatened legal action if I join a competitor. I told him I wasn't joining a competitor. I was joining a company that actually solved problems. My last day is Friday. If Saltcore is hiring senior operations analysts, I'd like to discuss opportunities." Leona smiled, remembering Hassan's careful diplomacy during their clandestine coffee meetings, his systematic documentation of Blueprint's decline, his moral struggle between loyalty to incompetent leadership and professional integrity. His decision to leave wasn't surprising. The surprising thing was that he'd stayed as long as he had, watching Jonas dismantle operational systems that had taken decades to build. She typed back, "We're always interested in people who understand the difference between managing perception and creating value. Coffee Monday to discuss specifics?" The response came within minutes. "Monday sounds perfect. Thank you for building a door." Building a door. Hassan's phrase captured something essential about what Saltcore represented. Not just an alternative to Blueprint's corporate dysfunction, but proof that competent people could create companies where operational excellence was valued over strategic performance art. The kind of workplace where technical expertise was rewarded rather than repackaged as someone else's innovation. Another email arrived, this one from an address she didn't recognize. Coyle, Blueprint Dynamics. Jonas, writing from his corporate account with typical disregard for professional boundaries. "Leona," the message began. "I've had time to reflect on recent developments, and I think we should discuss the situation professionally. Blueprint invested significant resources in developing the methodologies that Saltcore is now using commercially. While I understand that personnel transitions can be complex, there are intellectual property considerations that need to be addressed. I'd like to schedule a conversation about potential collaboration opportunities that could benefit both organizations." Leona read the message twice, parsing the corporate doublespeak that disguised legal threats as collaboration opportunities. Jonas was finally understanding that Saltcore represented more than just personnel defection. It was systematic evidence that Blueprint's operational capabilities were built on foundations he couldn't replicate or replace. His attempt to claim intellectual property ownership over methodologies she'd developed was predictable, but also pathetic in its transparent desperation. She deleted the email without responding. Jonas's problems were no longer her responsibility to solve. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eva. "Channel 7 wants to interview you about the federal contract win. Something about Chicago's rising consulting stars. Want me to schedule it?" Leona considered the offer. 6 months ago, she would have deflected media attention, preferring to work behind the scenes rather than managing public perception. But Saltcore's visibility was important, not for ego gratification, but because other competent professionals needed to know that alternatives to corporate dysfunction were possible. "Schedule it," she typed back. "But make sure they understand we're talking about operational excellence, not personal success stories." That evening, alone in the office after everyone else had gone home, Leona opened the project journal she'd maintained throughout her Blueprint years. Pages of technical notes, client assessments, crisis management frameworks, and systematic solutions to problems that others had dismissed as unsolvable. 20 years of institutional knowledge that had been essential to Blueprint's success, but invisible to their leadership. On the final page, written during a particularly frustrating week when Jonas had presented her crisis management framework as his strategic innovation, she'd scribbled a note to herself. "One day I'll sign something. That's actually mine." Now, surrounded by evidence of what that signature could accomplish, client contracts bearing her name, team members who'd chosen competence over corporate politics, operational frameworks that solved actual problems rather than managing stakeholder expectations. Leona understood that the note had been prophecy rather than wishful thinking. She opened her laptop and pulled up Saltcore's latest project proposal, a comprehensive operational assessment for a renewable energy consortium that would establish the company's reputation in an entirely new market sector. The methodology was sophisticated but practical, the timeline was realistic but ambitious, and the outcomes were measurable rather than aspirational. At the bottom of the final page, she typed, "Leona Reyes, Chief Executive Officer, Saltcore Labs." But before sending the proposal, she made one addition, a brief author's note that would have been impossible during her blueprint years. This framework represents Saltcore's systematic approach to operational architecture, developed specifically for the unique challenges of distributed renewable energy systems. Our methodology prioritizes practical implementation over theoretical transformation, measurable outcomes over strategic positioning. It was the kind of professional honesty that corporate environments discouraged, the acknowledgement that consulting should be about solving client problems rather than selling client hope. But it was also something more personal, evidence that Leona Reyes no longer needed permission to claim credit for her own competence. Her phone chimed with a message from Silas. "Saw the federal contract announcement in the Tribune. How does it feel to be essential to yourself?" She typed back, "Like I should have done this 20 years ago." "Maybe," came the reply, "but you're doing it now. That's what matters. Dinner this weekend to celebrate?" Dinner sounds perfect. Outside, Chicago's skyline glittered with the lights of 1,000 ambitions, including her own. Somewhere, in that forest of glass and steel, Jonas was probably working late, trying to rebuild operational capabilities that had walked out the door when competent people finally had permission to leave. Somewhere else, other professionals were documenting corporate dysfunction while planning their own exits, their own alternatives, their own versions of Saltcore Labs. But here, in a converted manufacturing loft in Pilsen, something sustainable was taking shape. Not a reaction to Blueprint's failures, but a positive assertion of what consulting could look like when it was built by people who actually understood how systems worked. The kind of company that attracted clients who valued solutions over presentations, team members who chose substance over politics, and leaders who signed their own work rather than appropriating other people's innovations. Leona saved the proposal, attached her digital signature, and hit send. Then she opened a new document and began planning Saltcore's expansion into renewable energy consulting, sketching organizational structures and operational frameworks that would scale competence rather than managing incompetence. For the first time in her professional life, every blueprint bore her signature. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and